Well, this month's Buried Earth book project certainly took an unexpected turn. Up until very late in October, I had something quite different planned for November 1st, but then I'm blaming this all on my daughter. She sent me a link to a book that she found while she was doing research for a term paper. It turns out it's a book that's actually in the library where she works, and the title is Old Sinhalese Embroidery. Now, the book was published in 1906, so you can imagine, I'm imagining how old the embroidery actually is. It doesn't say in the book, but this book is actually written by somebody who's interested in textiles. So it actually answers a lot of questions that I had about cloth and textiles in Sri Lanka. And then she actually sent me another book. Now, perhaps this book looks a little different than what you would normally consider to be a book. It's called an ola, and it is an ancient Sri Lankan book form. The label with this particular book says that it is from the 1500s and that it is a collection of Vedarala or Ayurvedic charms that are used in the treatment of disease. And she tells me that her library is nothing like the Citadel in Game of Thrones. Personally, I think it's exactly like the Citadel and the real live version of the Citadel in Game of Thrones, if you've ever watched that show. So here I am with this information and what to do with it. And I found myself wanting to cast aside all of the other unfinished projects that I'm working on and start exploring these embroidery stitches. So in order to sate that need just a little bit, I've decided that some of these techniques need to find a place in this month's Buried Earth book projects. I decided to use the image that looks a lot like a caterpillar in the ola as my inspiration for the design, but I'm not going to recreate that exact piece. I'm just going to start, as I often do, without a template or anything, and I'm just going to let my embroidery stitches emerge as they will. Now, the book tells me that Sri Lankan embroidery was mainly done using chain stitch, so that's the stitch that I've decided to use, and there were 3 colors used for the embroidery: red, blue, and white. One of those colors being the color of the cloth often, and the other 2 used for embroidery. So I already have my white cloth, and I've got some blue embroidery floss, and the closest approximation to red that I could find is a burgundy color, but I think that's not a problem. I think ancient dyes were not bright fire engine red that we think of, but I think the burgundy is a good approximation to use. So I finished my caterpillar using the chain stitch, and then I decided to use the first of the stitches that are described in the book. It creates these little square blocks by doing 2 fly stitches back to back and then filling in the center area with satin stitch. Well, my stitches don't exactly look like squares, but that's okay. It's the first time I'm doing this stitch. I can practice some more. So I've created my little caterpillar using fly stitch for the legs, and I was a little puzzled, so I looked this up. Why don't caterpillars have 6 legs? Because I noticed that they often look like they have far more than 6 legs. Apparently they do only have 6 legs. They are insects after all, but they have extra fake legs. I don't know. This was the explanation. They have things that look like legs but are not legs. Proto-legs, perhaps. I don't know. Another thing that old Sinhalese embroidery tells me is that many of the old embroideries had elaborate borders around the outside. So I've decided to put a border around my caterpillar, and I'm using another of the stitches in my book for the border, and this one is a threaded chain stitch. So it's kind of a variation on a chain stitch. And interestingly, I just come across this stitch recently in an online database of embroidery stitches, and they refer to it as a Sinhalese stitch. And I was curious to find out why it was called Sinhalese stitch, and I could not find any explanation, but now I know it's in the old Sinhalese embroidery book. So I started out doing that stitch for my border, and it was really fiddly and fumbly, and I was having a really hard time doing it. And my mental story that I was telling myself as I'm doing this is really hard. I don't like this. This is really awkward. It's not at all easy to do, and I'm never doing this again after this example. I'm never doing this again. I almost gave up, but then I decided I would at least finish this one border. And then I had this revelation. I was doing the stitch in a really complicated way. There were much easier ways to do it, so I just changed the direction that I was sewing in, and I didn't have to use two hands anymore, and it became so much easier. And by the time I finished, it was actually not that complicated. It was not as hard as I thought it was when I first started. And I found that with many things, that when you first start, they seem so complicated and you feel so awkward and you don't have any instincts. But if I persist, things become easier as time goes along. And as I relaxed and this became easier, my thought shifted, and I just started thinking about different things. And I found myself thinking about the time that I went to Mexico, to Oaxaca, over the Dia de los Muertos period, and I found myself thinking about a rug that I bought there at a women's cooperative in Teotitlan in the rug weaving village. The rug was woven by the head of the cooperative. Her name is Pastora. And as I was leaving with my rug, she came running out and she started telling me about the symbols that she had woven into the rug. Their little images, their little shapes in the middle are butterflies, and she said that they're a symbol of freedom, and then they have a border around the butterflies, and she said when they put a border around something, it's actually a symbol of protection. Then I had this really impetuous idea. When I was in Mexico, one of the really prevalent things were these marigold flowers. They were everywhere. And I knew that there was a house a few blocks away from where I lived that had a rather large profusion of huge dandelions. And I thought I should go over there and ask the people who live in the house whether I might have one of their flowers for art purposes. And I immediately started to feel really uncomfortable and anxious about doing that. And I thought, no, I'm going to do it. So I walked over there, rang the doorbell, and the woman who lived there didn't come to the door. She answered me from the balcony above, and I had to laugh because that's what I do when strangers come to my house. I don't go down to the front door. I talk to them from my balcony. And she was ever so sweet. I asked her if I may have one flower for an art project, and she says, "Of course, my dear, you can have as many as you like. Take as many as you like." So I took two, and those made their way into my book as well. I sprinkled some of the flowers on top of the page, and the rest of the flowers got sprinkled into the ground and returned to the ground under the pear tree with my page for this month. And there it is. It's back in the ground for one more month, and now I have to decide what to do for next month. Do I do what I had planned for November at the beginning of December, or do I go with what I was thinking of doing for the last page in my book? Well, I will let you know next month, and thank you again for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.